welcome everyone to the first workshop of the autumn term 2021. Really good to be back with you. Welcome to all our new listeners. I've got a set of 4 talks for you this term. All of the talks cover a theme which relates to the museum collections, and we use museum objects as the starting point for each part of the narrative in the talk. So today we're going to be looking at a set of objects held in the British Museum, some of them on display, some of them held in storage. And we're going to be having a look at how they actually came from their first life as an object being used by the human community to what could be called the third part of their life in the museum. And what we're going to be focusing on is that middle bit, the second part of their life, where they stop being part of a human community, they stop being used on a regular, everyday basis. They then go into what archaeologists would refer to as the archaeological record. Historians would call it the historical record, where they are to some extent lost. They go out of everyday circulation. And then the third part is when they are rediscovered. They may actually be spending the second part of their life in plain sight, as we'll find with some of them. But the third part of their history, where they then become part of a museum collection and start to operate as a primary source of evidence, allowing us to learn about the past. And very often in museums, there is a concentration on the first part of their life. What was this object used for? And what I want to do today is throw a little bit of light on the second part of their life, what's often referred to as their provenance. How did they actually arrive at the museum? Who owned them, or where were they during that middle section of their life biography? So I'm going to begin by getting up my PowerPoint, and we're going to have our talk from the beginning. So today's talk from the British Museum is From Here to There, Object Journeys into the British Museum Collection. And also during our talk today, I will be using my trusted little red pointer. So at some points you will see I'll be talking about a particular part of the object and will indicate this on screen with my red pointer. So let's get started. And we are going to begin with an object known as Frank's Casket. And Frank's Casket is on display at the British Museum. It's on display in room 41, which is the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval gallery. And in essence, a casket means a small box or a chest, something precious, perhaps jewels, letters, or other items of value. And the casket itself is often itself made from valuable materials and richly ornamented. This particular casket is a lidded rectangular box carved with scenes accompanied by a number of different scripts. And we're going to be looking at those in detail. So here are the scenes on each side of the casket, and surrounding them is text in a number of different scripts, both insular scripts and world scripts. And there also originally was carving on the lid, and we'll find out a little bit more about why the casket as we see it today in the museum actually looks as if it's in quite a state of disrepair. And we can look inside and you can see cracked bottom to the casket. There's a lot of wear on the bottom, and that gives us a little clue as to what the casket is made from. And you can see from the main picture and the smaller picture down here to the right that parts of the casket are missing. So we have information on the casket that shows us that previously it would have had additional material, because not only is there a very large hole, but also you can see on the back here a number of smaller holes, and they're replicated on the front. So it indicates some sort of pinning, some sort of nailing of something directly onto the casket. Now, in terms of date, the inscriptions show that the person who carved the casket used a Northumbrian or North Mercian dialect, which was current in the early 700s. And the style of the casket recalls Northumbrian manuscript art of around the same time. So we're starting to build up an idea that this is a casket made around AD 700. The casket's mix of Roman, Christian, Jewish, and Germanic traditions reflects the interest of the Northumbrian aristocratic and monastic circles at this time. And it's particularly interesting, the Germanic inclusions, because we know from a reproachful letter written to the monks of Lindisfarne by Alkel that they were being rebuked for the telling of Germanic tales about Germanic heroes instead of concentrating on monastic and biblical stories. So we know that Germanic tales were circulating in storytelling oral form at this time. So it seems very probable that this is Northumbrian in origin. The casket itself was found in France. And this bit of its story is an unknown, because it's not known exactly how and when the casket arrived in France, although it's possible that it was taken by a Frankish scholar, Frithgod, who was active in Northumbria and also in France around 900. So about 200 years after it was made, it was probably taken from Northumbria across to northern France, and it was kept at the Church of St. Julian. And experts think that it then remained in this church as a holy object, a church object, until it was looted during the French Revolution. So the 1790s, it's looted, and it next surfaces the point at which it is properly documented, and where we can actually pick up a definite provenance, is when it was found being used as a domestic sewing box in France. Now, at this point, the silver hinges and fittings had been removed and were probably traded around 1800. Now, without the support of the silver fittings, which now explains the pinholes that we can see on various parts of the casket itself fell apart. And these parts, the individual panels, were shown to a professor who lived locally, who bought them from the family and then sold them to an antique shop in Paris. They were bought from this antique shop in 1857 by Augustus Franks, who donated the panels to the British Museum in 1867. And this is the point where they enter our collections, where they start the third part of their journey, and where they now sit on public display. Now, interestingly, Franks bought the casket panels and donated it to the museum, but this was not the first time in its history that the museum had had an opportunity to acquire these pieces of the casket. They'd previously been offered them in 1858 for 100 guineas, were dismissed by the curators of the time as, and I quote, some ancient carvings in ivory, and they decided not to buy them. The missing right end panel was later found in a drawer by the family who had been using the casket originally as a sewing box, and was sold to a museum in Florence, where it remains to this day. So the replica of this piece is shown in the British Museum, and the casket itself is commonly known as Frank's casket after its donor. So let's have a quick look at some of the detail on this casket that we've mentioned as part of its history. So this shows you how the casket looks in the museum when it's on display. It's been reassembled, and you can actually see the perspex pieces that have been added in to hold the panels in their correct positions. So here we have the front panel and the rear panel. The front panel with the missing lock, which we now know was removed around 1800 and sold for its scrap value. And the front part is divided into two panels. We can see the dividing line down the centre there. And on the left, we have the story of Wayland the Smith, an Anglo-Saxon god of smiths associated with horses, magic, cunning, metalworking, and healing. And then to the right, we have the adoration of the three kings. And there we can see the Virgin Mary sitting in an arched frame. And then with a halo around him, we have the child Christ sitting on her lap. So we have an Anglo-Saxon scene, the Germanic tradition, that the monks of Lindisfarne were being rebuked for still enjoying as a storytelling occupation, together with a biblical scene. And also the main inscription on the front of the panel is a riddle, and it gives us a clue as to what this object is made from. It's written in Old English and translates as, "The sea lifted the fish onto the cliff edges. The terrible Lord became sad when he swam up onto the shingle." And this gives us the answer for the material from which the casket is made: whalebone, most probably a beached whale found on the coastline of Northumbria. And the bone from this beached whale was then processed and carved to make the panels for the casket. The back of the casket, this back scene, shows the capture of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman general, later emperor, Titus. And there are two pieces of text in the lower part of this panel which read "judgment" and "hostage." And the main inscription itself is a mixture of Old English, Latin, and runes. So a multilingual casket drawing on all the different spoken and in particular written languages being used in Northumbria around AD 700. And this inscription tells us, "Here Titus and a Jew fight. Here its inhabitants flee from Jerusalem." So the casket is also a historical recorder. It's telling us about history, the siege of Jerusalem from 700 years previously, captured alongside traditional Germanic traditions, Wayland the Smith, and also contemporary biblical traditions. The end pieces of the casket, well, the left end takes us back to the tradition we saw with the siege of Jerusalem, because we're back with the Romans. And what we have here on the left-hand end is the story of Romulus and Remus with the wolf who mothered them before they grew up to found the city of Rome. And then the right-hand end, which is a cast at the British Museum, because the original is in Florence, recalls a lost Germanic legend. We don't know anything about this particular story, but the inscriptions tell us that this person sitting right at the end of the panel, sitting on a small mound, is actually a person called Egril, and it seems that they are sitting on a sorrow mound. So this is a lost Germanic tale, which was obviously in spoken circulation at the time, has been captured on this panel. There is still scholarly debate about exactly how the inscription should be translated. They've been able to translate the information about the Sorrow Mound, but not much else is known about what is happening in the scene, which is actually a very busy scene with the person on the Sorrow Mound, someone speaking to them, a horse, someone who may or may not be of the early church, and then 3 additional figures. So this was obviously an action-packed story, but at the moment, we know no further details than the fact that at one point someone was sitting on a sorrow mound. And then the decorated lid of the story, you can see part of this is missing. The decorated lid is itself another Germanic story, who is a hero defending his home from armed raiders, and it just has a single word on it, which gives us his name, Hoss. So the Franks casket came on a journey from northern England, where it was probably part of a monastic tradition, probably held in a monastic house, or may have been held in an aristocratic house. It then travelled possibly via a Frankish scholar to France, where it was found, and then parts of it were sold back to the collector Augustus Franks, who donated it to the British Museum, where it now lives. We're now going to go on to an object which is also on display in Gallery 41, and this is a Viking object. This object is known as the Curedale Horde. Now, a hoard is in essence a group of objects which have been collected together deliberately, and at some point in their history have been stored. And this storage may be storage in response to a crisis. There are a lot of hoards from late Roman Britain, which we think may have been buried as society started to change its structure with the end of the Roman Empire, and hoards were buried for safekeeping. Hoards may have been stored together as a collection of the works of a silversmith or a goldsmith who collected all the precious metals together to be melted down and then turned into other forms of jewellery. We've got a lovely Roman hoard found at one end of Hadrian's Wall, which is a jeweller's collection, which has all the little gold rings, all the little engraved gem bezels that are going to be fitted into the rings. Also has all the little working tools as well. Now, the Curedale Horde is indeed a collection of precious items. They are all silver, and it is the largest Viking Age silver hoard from Northwest Europe, and it comprises 8,500 items which were originally stored in a lead-lined chest. It's mainly coins, and if we look at some of the items which are on display in the British Museum, you can pick out some of the coins that were part of the hoard. There were also ingots, amulets, chains, rings, and cut-up brooches and armlets. And the cut-up pieces are rather wonderfully known as hack silver. And this is where a piece of worked silver has been deliberately cut up to reduce it to smaller pieces, which then in the future would be more suitable for melting down to create a new item from the silver. Also, 5 bone pins were recorded, and the items may originally have been fastened inside cloth bags, but these did not survive. Fabric is very unlikely to survive in cold, wet British soil and had rotted away by the time that the hoard was found. Now, the weight of the gold was almost 40 kilograms, and it's probably the collected wealth of many people rather than one individual. Now, silver, we know, formed the basis of currency in the Viking Age and was often buried in times of unrest. Now, the coins that were already mentioned, they are very useful because the coins which are dated, the date when they were minted or marked with the ruler under which they were minted, help us to establish that the Curedale Horde was buried, probably by Vikings, around AD 903 to AD 905. So we've got a 2-year window from the latest dated coins in the collection. And this coincides with when the Vikings were expelled from Dublin in 902. No one reclaimed the hoard, and thus it started its journey, unknown to its owners at the time, towards its museum life. Now, Curedale lies at the beginning of an overland route to Viking York. So most of the coins were minted in Viking England, others are Anglo-Saxon, and there are also coins from mainland Europe and Arabic coins, which indicates that the owners of the hoard were engaged in extensive trading or had extensive political links at this time. So the hoard, most probably a collection of items which belong to a group of Viking traders, possibly, was gathered together. The people were expelled from Dublin. They moved back towards Viking York and the Viking northeast. And on the way, they bury their hoard for safety at Curedale. Now, the hoard itself was found by a group of workers who were travelling back across farmland at Curedale, and they were walking along by the edge of a river, and there had been a landslide, and the local landslide near the River Ribble, it exposed land behind the existing riverbank, and sticking out of this land they saw the remains of the lead casket. They pulled the casket out of the soil, opened it to find it filled with the silver items. The items were then collected and gathered and removed by the landlord's bailiff, although some items subsequently went missing. That's often a part of a story on its journey from the archaeological record to the museum. That has happened with other hoards that we have in our collection. The remainder was declared treasure trove and handed to Queen Victoria. She passed it to the British Museum, where the bulk of it remains today, although about 60 items are held by the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and some of the coins in the collection, which were minted in northern France, are held by a museum in Boulogne. So the British Museum holds the majority of the hoard, but it at the moment, rather like Frank's casket, resides in numerous museums, this time 2 in the UK, 1 in France, and is now part of the public display in the museum galleries. Now, the next object we're going to look at is called the Fuller brooch. Now, the Fuller brooch is also an Anglo-Saxon item, and it dates from the late 800s. It's a large circular brooch made from hammered silver, and it's decorated with 5 figures. And if we look at those 5 figures, we can see that they're wearing tunics and a short jacket. And in the center, the main figure represents the sense of sight. And the 5 figures in the middle represent between them the 5 senses. So here we have sight with their large oval eyes, and the other 4 senses can all be identified by their actions. So taste has a hand in their mouth, smell has their hands behind their back and stands between two tall plants, suggesting the act of sniffing. And if you look carefully, you can just see that the figure's nose is directed toward one of those flowers. Touch below is rubbing hands together, whilst hearing has a hand held up toward the ear. And then in the outer border, there are decorations which include human, bird, animal, and plant motifs. And the figures stand out so clearly against this silver background because the engraving lines around the figures have been filled with a black mixture made from sulfur and metal ore, which is used as an inlay and which then hardens when baked. And this brooch may well have come from the royal workshops of King Alfred. It is one of the best examples of elite Anglo-Saxon brooch jewellery from this period. And such a prestigious brooch would have been worn by both men and women. They could have been worn singly. They certainly would have been worn on the outside of a garment for maximum effect in impressing people who saw you wear it. Now, the history of this particular brooch is unknown until the late 1800s, so it's got a large gap in its history, but its fine condition suggests that it was passed down perhaps as a family heirloom. It has been kept very carefully, and the lack of damage on the surface and the lack of wear on the brooch itself indicates it's unlikely to have ever been buried. There are two small holes at the top of it, which indicate that it may have been suspended and worn as a pendant. There was originally a pin on the back, which would have allowed it to be worn on an outer garment as a brooch, but this is missing, and it does seem that at some point in its history, it was turned into a necklace. So again, reinforces this idea that it may have been passed down within a family as an heirloom. Now, it came into the museum in a little wooden leather-covered case. And this little wooden leather-covered case dates to either the 1600s or 1700s. So it suggests that at that point in its history, it was probably a collector's item, and it had had a bespoke little case made for its storage, and it, rather than being worn as a prestigious everyday jewellery item, now was operating as a collector's item, an item of antiquity. In its more recent history, it was purchased from a London bric-a-brac trader by an unnamed person who subsequently passed it on to a gentleman called Sir Charles Robinson. And he published the brooch, which means that he would have had drawings made of the brooch and he would have written a small commentary. And this was published in the journal Antiquity in 1910. So this is the first point where it enters modern scholarly debate. Now, a few years later, his son-in-law offered the brooch as a loan to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and they accepted it as a loan and put it on display. However, shortly afterwards, on the advice of the keeper of British and medieval antiquities at the British Museum, Sir Heracles Reed, the brooch was declared a fake. The British Museum said that it could not possibly be Anglo-Saxon in origin, that it was a modern fake, and they advised the Ashmolean to withdraw it from display. The Ashmolean did so. So the brooch, at this point in its history, stops being an antiquity, stops being seen as a museum object. And it was purchased from Sir Charles Robinson's son-in-law by a gentleman called Captain Fuller, for its silver value. So at this point, it is being sold as silver bullion for the weight and the value of the silver from which it is made. And apart from occasional mentions in journals, it wasn't thought of seriously until the British Museum itself acquired the Strickland brooch in 1949. And here is the Strickland brooch. The Strickland brooch looks very similar to the Fuller brooch. It has a similar design. This time it has 5 bosses, a central geometric design surrounded by small, what are probably hunting dogs. These hunting dogs are some of my favourite dogs at the British Museum. Look at their beautiful large hound paws. And if you look very carefully, you can see that some of them are wearing little collars, indicating that they are domestic dogs, part of a hunting pack during Anglo-Saxon times. And when the Strickland brooch was acquired by the British Museum and its provenance and its history was established and its identity as an Anglo-Saxon brooch, which interestingly, if you look right at the very top of it, has also at some point had a suspension hook added to it. So at some point it changed from being a brooch to being worn as a necklace, the same as the Fuller brooch. And when they acquired this, which was sold as part of the collection of a lady called Mrs. Strickland, hence its name, who lived in Bridlington, and it was sold from Mrs. Strickland's collection by Sotheby's, and it was purchased by an American collector. However, when it was bought at Sotheby's, the fact that its purchaser was American meant that an export license had to be granted to remove it from the country, and this was refused. So the American collector ceded the brooch to the British Museum, who had also bid for it during the Sotheby's sale, and it was purchased by the British Museum for the price that the American collector had paid for it in 1949. And this was what prompted the British Museum to investigate what had happened to the once scorned Fuller brooch. And they traced the brooch to the ownership of Captain Fuller, and the British Museum Research Laboratory then investigated the brooch, looking in particular at the material, black metal and sulphur inlay, and by analysing its composition, they were able to declare that the Fuller brooch was indeed genuine. And in 1952, Captain Fuller donated the brooch to the British Museum on the condition that it was henceforth known as the Fuller brooch. And that is the name under which you will find it currently displayed at the British Museum. So an object which passed from a treasured family heirloom into a period of obscurity during which it was declared by the British Museum to be a fake. It was then rehabilitated with the help of the Strickland brooch, and now proudly sits on display in the Anglo-Saxon Gallery. We're now going to move to the next door gallery. We're going to move to medieval England, and we're going to look at a set of objects known as the Tring tiles. Now, the Tring tiles, which you see here on the screen, were probably originally part of a wall frieze in the chancel of Tring Parish Church. And the gaps in the gospel narrative around the life of Christ, particularly his early life, led in medieval times to the growth of a set of legends about Christ's childhood, a set of apocryphal tales where people attempted to fill in the gaps between the narrative that the Gospels provided, which is limited in terms of the period from Jesus's birth There's the point where he goes to the temple and amazes the elders, and then the rest of the Gospels really concentrate on the period of his ministry. So these tales are an attempt to contextualise a young Christ for the congregation at Tring Church. And the tales are really an indication of Christ's divine status and his miraculous abilities from an early age. So, for example, here we have in this scene a picture of a boy who has been messing about with some little mud pools that Jesus had been building on the banks of the River Jordan. And in response, Jesus has struck him dead. The Virgin Mary appears on the scene, admonishes Jesus, who has to restore the boy to life. A similar fate befalls a boy who had been fighting with Jesus, who Jesus struck dead. The arrival of the boy's parents, and in this case Joseph, Jesus is forced to bring him back to life. The tales underneath are a lovely response from the local parents, who, so concerned about their children playing with Jesus, up in towers to prevent Jesus coming around and saying, would they like to come out to play? So you can see here the parent holding the key that he's used to lock the tower door. But Jesus in the next scene manages to rescue him, miraculously opens the door and says, oh, come on, we're going out to play. The parents then decide that they are going to lock their children in an oven to keep them safe. That part of the story is missing. But Jesus then asks Joseph, what's in that oven? Because you can hear the scuffling noises. Joseph then says, pigs, pigs, there's some pigs in the oven. Jesus goes, turns the children into pigs. The door of the oven is opened, the pigs escape, and Jesus is told to turn the pigs back into the children that he always knew were hiding in there from him. So overall, these tiles would have represented a large wall frieze, possibly in the porch of Tring Church, which people at that time with lower levels of literacy would have been able to read in the manner almost of a comic strip, whereby the images are telling the story with no written narrative. Now, the tiles were covered up in the early 700s when the church was wainscoted and beautified by the owner of Tring Park, William Gore. So at this point, the tiles would have been sitting still on the wall behind false wooden panels. Now, these alterations were stripped out in the early 1880s, so Victorian renovations, and at this point the tiles themselves were removed. And in the years after the restoration, some Tring residents reported finding fragments of medieval tiles during the demolition of garden walls and paths, which suggests that the material removed from the church during the Victorian renovation, including the tiles, was then treated as rubble, which was presumably crushed to be mixed in with mortars and cements for local building works. The tiles at the British Museum, which had survived this process, were offered for sale at a curiosity shop in Tring shortly after the restoration work, and were purchased for a few shillings by the Reverend Owen, who was the vicar of a nearby parish. Now, he asked the shop owner how he acquired the tiles, but the shop owner would never say. So the assumption is that someone working on the restoration process removed the tiles, recognised their value as objects, if only as curiosity, sold them to a local shopkeeper, and was probably known to the shopkeeper, hence his reluctance to name who had sold them to him. Now, when the Reverend Owen died in 1922, the contents of his rectory were sold. By this point, he was living in Essex, and a Chelmsford antique dealer brought the tiles for £17. He obviously recognised their value, not just as curiosities, but as historical items, and historical items with a well-known traditional provenance, the idea of the apocryphal Gospels, the apocryphal tales of Christ's childhood. And therefore he put them up for auction at Sotheby's. And this was where they were acquired by the British Museum. And interestingly enough, let me just remind you that the dealer had acquired them for £17. The British Museum, a few years later, only a couple of years later, acquired them at Sotheby's, where they paid £1,420. So he made a most handsome profit on his set of £17 tiles. Now, two more of the tiles, the ones that you see down at the bottom of the screen, actually aren't in the British Museum. These were presented by a Tring resident to the V&A Museum in 1927. So again, we're looking at an object which in its original context would have been part of a much larger collection of wall tiles, of which we now have a small selection, along with the Victoria and Albert Museum. And from the suggestion of tile fragments being found in walls and paths in Tring, it can only be assumed that unless there are surviving as yet undiscovered tiles, the remainder of the tiles were destroyed in late Victorian times and will no longer be able to enter the third part, the museum part of the object's histories. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to a 10-minute break. So if you would like to grab yourself a tea or a coffee or take a comfort break, we will be silent off air for 10 minutes and see you again for the second part of the talk. Hello and welcome back. And we're going to begin the second part of our talk with a burial. And this burial is on display in room 50 at the British Museum. It is displayed as what we call a reconstruction display, in that you can see that the objects in the museum are displayed in the context in which they were found, i.e. inside a burial pit dug into the ground, and are also displayed with the correct orientation. This means that they are displayed in exactly the position in which they were found in the burial. So when it was uncovered and the finds were recorded, these are the positions in which they were placed. Now, the Welwyn Garden City burial is a wealthy burial from the 1st century BC. So in historical terms, we are looking at the late Iron Age, before the arrival of the Romans and the occupation of Britain as part of the Roman Empire. And it reveals connections between southeast Britain and northern France in the years between Julius Caesar's military expeditions to Britain, which occurred in 55 and 54 BC, and then the ultimate invasion of Britain by Claudius in AD 43. And this 100-year period was a period of communication between what was the province of Gaul, modern France under the Romans, and the independent kingdoms in Britain. And this was a period where the Romans were really drawing Britain, and particularly England, into their sphere of influence, starting to develop trading connections and also starting to develop diplomatic and political connections. And just behind these two plates, you can just see the edge of a pile of cremated bones. These are the bones of the person for whom the grave was constructed. They were placed in a pile at the north end of the grave, close to 24 glass gaming pieces. And amongst the cremated remains, the bones were in such a state when they were recovered that they could not be aged or sexed, were 6 bone fragments from a bear, which may originally have been part of a bear's skin that the cremated bones were wrapped in. Now, originally, the grave may have been divided in 2 by a wooden object, which itself had ornamental brass studs. The wooden object had completely decayed away in the wet, cold British soil, but the studs were found on the floor of the burial chamber. And the other side of where the studs were found, what we refer to as the southern end of the grave, there are a group of grave goods, items which have been deliberately placed into a grave, either as objects which it was assumed the person who was buried would need or would take with them on their journey into the afterlife, whatever the afterlife of that time was conceived as being. And that may be why the glass gaming pieces were in the grave, because it was assumed that the person would want to have leisure time and be playing games in the afterlife. But also, the other reason that objects could be placed in a grave was that part of their deposition during the funeral was a way of indicating to the surviving community and to the heirs of the person, who would be the next people to take up the reins of power, the status, the wealth, the connections that this person held in life and was perhaps passing on to their heir. So what we find amongst these grave goods are not only items made in Iron Age Britain, but also a small silver cup. You can see it just here, tucked in between the pottery and the ceramics. And this is a small silver cup with 2 handles, and it is Roman. So we have an object here which has been produced in the Roman Empire, has perhaps been purchased as a sign of wealth by an Iron Age ruler in England, perhaps has been gifted by the Romans as a way of building a political alliance with important people in southern England. And also, interestingly, is a demonstration by this Iron Age ruler of the fact that they are conversant with the forms of a Roman lifestyle, because this silver cup is a silver cup for drinking wine, the amphoras for which we see lined up at the back of the grave. And these would have been amphoras for transporting liquids, wine, perhaps sauces, the fish sauce that was so popular in the Roman Empire. So what we have in this grave are a collection of objects which speak not only to the person's life as an Iron Age ruler, but also to the period in British history where certainly southern England is starting to build up deliberately cultivated relationships with the Roman Empire just across the Channel in Gaul. And it's these relationships which the Romans then use as they start to establish their power base in southern England as part of the invasion of Britain from AD 43 onward. But what about this object and its journey to the museum? Well, this object we know was buried in late Iron Age times, so about 2,000 years ago. And for the majority of its life, it lay as part of the archaeological record. That means that it has gone out of human circulation. The funeral, the closing of the grave, meant that these objects were a memory for the community, but were no longer actively part of human activity. And they were then subject to the conditions of the soil around them. And during this part of its history, we know that some of the objects were lost. We know, for example, that the textiles, the potential bear skin that was used to wrap the bones were lost due to the wet, cold conditions and the acidic nature of the soil in this part of Britain. So some of the objects are lost over 2,000 years, some of them remain. They enter a stable relationship with the soil around them, and objects which are particularly good at surviving over a long period of time are pottery and also metal objects, particularly metal objects made from very pure metals such as gold and silver, hence the survival of so much pottery and the little silver cup. These objects started their life in the third part of their history as museum objects in March 1965. So actually quite a recent discovery, given that they had been buried for 2,000 years. And in March 1965, an exciting find came to the attention of the Welling Archaeological Society in Hertfordshire. And they had received a letter from a Mr. Robertson of Stevenage. And the letter was accompanied by a sketch of an amphora. So a sketch of an object looking just like what we now know one of the objects in the grave was. And he said he'd seen this amphora, not in the ground, but in the garage of a gas board employee called Mr. Day, who had dug it up while laying pipes in a new estate not far from Welling Garden City High School. So on the 25th of April 1965, two members of the society went to Stevenage to meet Mr. Robertson to find out more. Apparently, according to the records of the society, Mr. Robertson gave them a cup of coffee and also directions to Mr. Day's house. And at Mr. Day's house, they found not one, but two amphora in his garden, which he said he was going to use in his garden to grow plants in. Or he said he might be persuaded to sell them to the society for £10. The society declined the offer to purchase the items. They were not a museum or a storage society, and instead decided to photograph them. The next day, they followed a rough map provided by Mr. Day to visit the site where he had actually dug these amphora up originally. And what they found when they got to the site was that the work trenches that he and his colleagues had been digging to lay gas pipes had been filled back in with the gas pipes now in place for the new housing estate. But they found bits of pottery along the edge of a nearby road, demonstrating that there had been a disturbance of items previously buried beneath the soil during the process of digging this trench, and indeed the process of digging the foundation space for this new road. So they went back to see Mr. Day, who said he also remembered seeing bits of pottery on the other side of the road. They went back to the site, and this time with a more accurate description of where the majority of the pottery had surfaced. They discovered other bits of pottery, but also, and most importantly, alongside the bottom of a third amphora, they found 3/4 of a crumpled silver cup. This silver cup that we see here on display at the museum. And the society contacted the police immediately, aware that under treasure trove laws of the time, the fines could lead to a coroner's inquest. The police took a statement and also the silver cup. A meeting was then held with the Development Corporation, who were the people responsible for building the new housing estate, the British Museum, other interested parties, and a metal detectorist who was employed to locate additional metal finds. The Ministry of Works, who were the government body who were responsible for archaeology in England at that time, initially offered the Society a grant of £100 if they would like to excavate the site. But this plan fell through, and on the 7th of April, Dr. Anthony of Verulamium Museum and Ian Stead, who was the Minister of Ancient Monuments, visited the find site. Ian Stead took charge of all the plans, photographs and information gathered by the Society members and declared that the excavation was now under his control. The Society were no longer to be involved in the uncovering or the recording of the excavation site. Mr. Day, however, refused to relinquish his amphora and refused to say who else had been working with him on the gas trench. So what we don't know is whether other employees had also removed items that had been recovered during the initial gas trench laying and might have items in their homes. Ministry of Work excavation was led by Ian Stead, and he later worked as a curator at the British Museum. The excavation went on from the 12th to the 23rd of April, and the Society, who were excluded from the site, turned their attentions to other projects. Now, the excavation took place on land owned by the Welwyn Garden City Development Corporation and was only uncovered because this land, which had previously been farmland, was having trenches dug into it for the infrastructure for the new housing estate. So under treasure trove rules in operation at the time, the objects recovered from that land were not deemed to be treasure trove. Since they'd been buried without any intention to retrieve them, because they were quite clearly part of a burial assemblage, they therefore became the property of the corporation. The objects, plus the silver cup held by the local police, were donated by the corporation to the British Museum and are currently on display in Gallery 50. And this idea that objects that are recovered from an excavation naturally become part of a wider historical record, the fact that this doesn't always happen is clearly demonstrated by the Welwyn Garden objects and is reflected in more recent times by objects which were recovered in London from the London Mithraeum on the banks of the Walbrook that originally ran across London. It now runs through a culvert to join the River Thames. And the objects that were recovered from the Mithraeum actually belong to the company who own the land on which the new office block was built, which uncovered the objects previously buried deep beneath the existing foundations from the 1960s buildings. And those objects from the Mithraeum are on display in the reception area of that office block. So they are on public display. You can go into the reception area and ask to see them, and they're in a glass display case behind the reception desk. But they are officially still part of a private collection. They have not yet become part of a public collection and could indeed remain in what we might refer to as the second part of their history, where they have not yet entered a museum for many, many years to come. Now, the next object we're going to look at is much, much smaller than the Welwyn burial. It is a tiny little pan. It's known as the Staffordshire pan, the Staffordshire Moorlands pan, also sometimes known as the Ilham pan. And it's a Roman object. It dates from the 2nd century AD, and it was originally a small ladle, all that has survived is the bowl part of the ladle, and originally there would have been a handle fixed to the bowl, enabling it to be used as a small ladle for scooping objects, probably as part of a religious ceremony, as what in Roman and Greek religion is known as a libation, where you pour a precious liquid onto an altar, onto a shrine, as a way of gifting that liquid to the gods or honouring an ancestor. And down below you will see there's an image which is the surround of the bowl pulled out in one shot. So if the bowl were to be cut and flattened out, this is what you would see. So the circular bowl itself has a simple beaded rim here at the top and a foot ring at the bottom. And there's a narrow zone of corrosion and solder splash immediately beneath the rim, which shows us where that handle was originally positioned. And also the area of corrosion shows us the width of the handle at the point of contact. It doesn't tell us the shape of the handle, because that handle might then have gone narrow, might have had a fancy end to it, but we know how wide the handle was where it joined the bowl. The handle was probably flat and probably had enamel inlay on the upper surface, similar to what we see on the bowl itself, which is decorated with a Celtic style ornamentation of roundels with small triangular motifs at the centre of each roundel, and it's decorated with red, blue, turquoise and yellow enamel. So there you can see in each roundel the lighter, the darker blue, the red, and then the central yellow. And that pattern and those colours are then repeated around the whole of the bowl. Now, immediately below the rim is an inscription, and this inscription runs, and you can see it here on the pulled out image, as an unpunctuated run of 56 letters. And these letters, when they are broken up and when experts look at the combinations of letters, they are able to work out, to decipher that they are the names of 4 forts on the western end of Hadrian's wall, listed in order from Bowness-on-Solway through to Castlestead. And there's an additional piece of inscription which reads Rigar Valley, which seems to refer to Hadrian's wall itself, which in Roman times was known as a vallum. So that might be the valley bit of it. Also has the word AELI, which suggests that we're referring here to Hadrian's wall specifically, because Auleus, the AELI, was Hadrian's family name. There's another name on the bowl, and that is the name Draco. And it's thought that this formed part of the personal name of a soldier, probably of Greek origin, who was serving in the Roman army, acquired citizenship under the Emperor Hadrian, and who had this bowl made as a souvenir of his military service on the wall. The bowl was found in June 2003 by metal detectorists, who promptly reported the find to the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And the Portable Antiquities Scheme is a scheme run by the British Museum and National Museum Wales to encourage the recording of exactly this sort of archaeological find. The PAS works with 119 partners and has a network of 40 locally based finds liaison officers. And members of the public can report finds such as this to a local finds liaison officer. And to date, over 1.5 million objects have been recorded and they're all publicly available on the PAS online database. Now, this particular pan, having been recorded and the PAS notified, was purchased in 2005 from the finder in conjunction with the landowners where it was found. And it was bought jointly by Carlisle Museum, the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent, and the British Museum, with the help of a grant of £112,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Now, because it was purchased by 3 separate museums, the pan actually rotates and is on a continual journey travelling between these 3 museums where it resides for a set amount of time across the year. And when it is not at the other 2 museums, a small replica is on display. So when you come to the British Museum and you go to Gallery 49 to see this object, it will either say on the label next to the object that you are looking at the original Ilam pan, or it may be one of the replicas which the British Museum holds and which it then pops into the display case when the original pan sets off on its journey to spend some time in Carlisle or Stoke-on-Trent. It now has an additional home. Another museum has been added into this journey, which is a museum on Hadrian's Wall. So if you're up on holiday at Hadrian's Wall and you're visiting the English heritage sites on the wall, that is another opportunity to meet the little Ilam pan if it's not in the British Museum. So with that object, we come to the end of our talk for today. And I hope that has given you an insight into how some of the objects in the British Museum galleries have made that journey from their original life through the archaeological record to public display. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. That was fantastic. Right, so let's see if we can get some of these questions. Which room are the tring tiles in?
They're in room 41. They're in the gallery. So we're looking at a set of objects which all sit next to each other on the upper floor. And the tring tiles, they're actually in their correct orientation. They're on the wall. And when you go into room 41, you just turn around. Not many people notice them because they're in the corner of a gallery, but they're set onto the wall. And then you have to pop down the V&A to see the others.
Do you know from the size of the wall how many tiles there may have been originally?
We think that they were originally inside the porch coming into the church rather than inside the church itself. So if we think about a modern church porch, the structure would have been there from the point when the porch was built. So they would have been at eye level so that people walking into the church would have seen them as they walked in and out of church before and after each service. So I don't think anyone has ever been down and measured the porch, but that is an excellent idea. I would have said if you were thinking about it in modern terms, it would be like a frieze of tiles that you would get set as a band across the middle part of a wall, so that as people walked past, it was then at eye level. So originally we've got 8, the V&A's got 2, so we've only got 10. I would have thought originally there would have been over 100 to fill a wall, because they're not particularly large. 2 of them together are about that big. So you'd have had over 100 to create the whole frieze. So many lost.
Yeah, it's just a tragedy, isn't it? With the Franks casket, are there any other surviving examples that are similar to that? So you can kind of so when you were putting it together, you had kind of a model to work on.
That's a very good question, because one of the ways that archaeologists learn about an object is by comparing it with other objects. And in its current form, there is nothing exactly the same as Frank's casket. There are lots of caskets from that period of history. There are caskets which come through from late Roman periods. Usually, and interestingly, they're made from precious materials. What's unusual about Frank's casket is that it's made from whale bone. So if you're in gallery 40, sorry, I've got my galleries the wrong way around, haven't I? Let me just change that. 41 is where Frank's casket is. The drink tiles are in gallery 40. If you're in gallery 41, there's another late Roman casket, the projector casket, and that is made from sheet silver. So what is unusual about Frank's casket in terms of not only its value to us as a museum, but in terms of how we can start to understand it, is the fact that it is fairly unique. And no other casket of this type is in a museum collection at the moment. So that is why comparisons to help us understand it have to go across to other materials. So that's why we're able to say that the carvings on it, the decorations on it, are similar to the decorations you find in painted manuscripts. So the runes and the script that is on it is similar to inscriptions that you find on other objects of the time. So there are runes on the bottom, on the back of jewellery from the Victorian period. There are inscriptions on the bottom of other caskets from the Viking period. But you have to pull in information, comparative information, from other types of objects that hold just part of the story, which when you then put them all together, help you to understand Frank's casket. And that is part of its value. Beyond its monetary value, its value as a fairly unique item of material culture from that time. If it had been buried, it most probably would have rotted away or been in a very decayed state. We have similar items made from ivory and bone, but if they're buried, they don't survive. It's only if they are out of direct contact with the soil. The Lewis chessmen, another example, because they were in a cave, they weren't buried in soil, that they actually survive.
Thank you. Does the Strickland brooch have the same inlay as the Fuller brooch?
Yes. And that was part of the reason that looking at the Strickland brooch and looking at that inlay, which is a mixture of sulphur and a metal ore, by analysing that in the science laboratories at the British Museum when the Strickland brooch was acquired, analysing that then enables them to look at the component parts of the inlay and also to look at the probable age of that inlay. And that was then used to go, oh, perhaps we need to relook at the Fuller brooch. And then they did exactly the same to the Fuller brooch, and exactly the same results came up, indicating that it wasn't a modern fake, that those were the original materials. And what's interesting there is that you can't, people often go, oh, but you could carbon date it. With something like silver, it is actually hard to date because silver in and of itself is millions of years old. It's then worked by humans, and you can get some dating in terms of technology that's being used to make the object. You can get dating in terms of its style and its shape. So the fact that it's decorated in that particular way, that it's operating as a brooch for thick cloth. But that can all be faked. And what you can't do is you can't go, oh, but let's just date the silver. The silver is silver. It can be melted down, recycled, and it still has the same age. It's the human interaction that allows the experts to date the object. And that is what they could do with the black inlay. The black inlay could be dated in terms of the fact that it was a mixture of different materials that was worked in a particular way. And by dating the black inlay, they then were able to date the whole brooch. Because the silver itself is dateless. It's stone as well, like a stone object. You can't carbon date a stone object because stone is millions of years old. You have to look at where it's found and how it's worked. You can only carbon date if it's an organic material. So fabric, paper, bones, they can be carbon dated.
Right. this question, how big is the Staffordshire pan? Can you give an idea of scale?
Palm size. It would sit in your palm. It's smaller than a ladle that we would use nowadays for soup. I'm just picking up something that I've got in the environment around me. It's probably about that size. It would sit in your hand. It is handheld, which is another reason why we think it was possibly made as a souvenir rather than as a purely functionary item. Although ladles of that size have been found in other collections. If you go onto the British Museum Collections online database and you look up the Reconstruction Horde, that has got similar small ladles, some of which still have their handles attached, that would have been used probably not for cooking ladling, but as part of an honouring or a ritual ceremony for pouring small amounts of precious liquid. So yes, it would literally just sit in your hand if you were holding it, and you have 2 fingers to pick up the ladle. It's very tiny, it's very sweet. You can see if you wanted it as a souvenir.
Right, I think that's all the questions. Has anyone else got any last minute questions? Give it a couple. No? Okay. Oh, sorry, I got someone raising their hand. Just give me a second. And let me give me a second.
Well, what I was also going to say while Martin's wrangling questions is that one of the other things we're always interested to hear back about from the people who join us for the workshops is the stories and the narratives and the themes that they have found interesting. We've done this idea of object journeys last year, and it was very popular, which is why we picked it up again this year. So if this is something that you find particularly interesting, that's opening up a new side to the museum collections that you hadn't known about, then that sort of feedback also then helps us when we start to decide what subjects we're going to have for the spring term. Because not only can we look at particular cultural areas and historical areas, but we can pick up themes like how does a museum get its objects? And it then just reveals not only the history of those objects, but the whole process of archaeology and curating objects. And as you heard with a couple of the examples today, the fact that very often bits of an object aren't necessarily all in the same museum.
Cool. I think Julie's raised her hand, so I'm going to let Julie talk. I think Julie, you can speak if you want to.
Hello, Julie.
Yes, it's just a very quick question about when it would be possible to see the Staffordshire pan in the British Museum. Does it have set part of the year when it's there?
What an excellent question. I'm going to go away and find out.
Thank you.
I hope you signed up for next week's talk, because what I'll do is when next week's talk starts, I'll pop some information into the chat box so that once people have signed on, they can then read information in the chat box. We had this last year as well. There was a couple of questions where, to be absolutely certain, I went away and double checked, and I just put the information in the chat box the next time, because that is an excellent question. And I'm going to be honest and say, I don't know. I look in the case myself and go, are you the real one? Look at the label. But the museum's been under lockdown, so we've either had it for a long time recently, or it's been somewhere else for a long time and we're due to get it soon. Let me find out for you.
Cool.
Better make a note of that.
I believe that is the end. So we will see you all next week. Is it trowel?
Yes, it's women archaeologists, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at women archaeologists operating in the Victorian and early 20th century world. So women whose stories have not been told. Some of the names you may be familiar with, but very often those names are familiar because you've heard of the male part of the team. So Hilda Petrie, you may have heard of Flinders Petrie. There's a lot of information about his work as an archaeologist. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of bypass Flinders and go to Hilda and start to uncover the stories of women working on some key archaeological sites. We're going to have a mention of Sutton Hoo. As you might imagine, there's quite a few women archaeologists involved in that. And if anyone's seen the film, don't believe the film. The story is quite different. We'll find out next
Sure,
week.
and all will be revealed next week. I like it. You've ended on a cliffhanger. Good.
I have.
Thank you for everyone to join today.
You're most welcome. Have lovely weeks, everyone. Thank you very much, Malcolm.
You're welcome. Thanks, Catherine. Bye-bye.